Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast. Ozcast. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Okay, so we're diving into something you flagged from USA Today, and it looks at travel advisories, the ones countries put out for their citizens, and those are specifically for entering the U.S.
Yeah, it's kind of a cluster of them, too. We've got the UK, Germany, Denmark, and Finland all updating theirs pretty recently.
Right, and you're all about staying informed without, getting lost in the weeds of the news cycle. So we got to break this down, like what's actually going on here.
Absolutely. And I think the fact that it's these very different European countries all kind of saying similar things right off the bat tells us something interesting is up. It's not just like tweaking the wording in a pamphlet.
Totally.
Yeah.
So let's start with the UK and Germany.
Yeah.
Theirs are pretty straightforward. I mean, they basically say, hey, even if you've got a visa or that ESTA thing, the electronic system for travel authorization, it's not a guarantee you're getting into the U.S.
Yeah, they're really laying it out there. And I think it boils down to this idea of just way more scrutiny at the border.
Which I guess is why they're highlighting all these stories about Europeans getting, stopped or even turned away, even with the right paperwork.
Exactly. They're seeing a trend and it's making waves over there.
And the article actually gives a couple of examples, like those two German nationals who got stopped at the southern border.
Oh, right. And the German Foreign Ministry is actually looking into one of those cases at least, which I think shows how seriously they're taking this.
So is there like a common denominator with these situations? Like what are the red flags that are popping up?
Well, the German advisory mentions a few things, giving false info, having some kind of criminal record, even if it's from way back, or like overstaying a visa even by a little bit.
And I guess what's really unsettling is they even say that you might not be able to appeal the decision right there at the border.
Yeah, you're kind of at the mercy of the border agent, which is a huge shift.
And that really ties in with the UK's warning too, right? They're straight up saying you could get arrested or detained if you mess up on the immigration rules. And it's not just isolated incidents either, right? Like we've seen reports about a Canadian woman being detained and a British artist too. It's like this pattern is emerging.
It definitely feels like a different climate. And the advice Germany's giving their citizens is telling, too. Like, they're saying, have proof of onward travel, be ready for tons of questions, and even call the U.S. Department of Homeland Security if you have any issues after you get back.
Wow, that's a lot more prep than just making sure your passport's up to date.
Right. It's a whole different ballgame.
And then you've got the U.S. State Department's response, which basically says we're just going to enforce the rules, visas and all that.
Like, no surprise there, right? They're not exactly rolling out the welcome mat.
So, okay, we've got that side of things,
Mm-hmm.
but then there's this whole other set of advisories from Denmark and Finland that are really specific and honestly kind of concerning.
Yeah, these ones are aimed squarely at transgender and non-binary travelers.
Right, and they're basically warning anyone with an X gender marker on their passport, or if their passport gender doesn't match their birth sex, to be extra careful coming to the U.S.
And it all comes down to the U.S. government's stance on gender markers. They only recognize male or female right now.
Which obviously clashes with a lot of countries that do recognize non-binary or third gender identities.
And it creates this impossible situation for people whose documents accurately reflect who they are according to their own country's rules.
Exactly. And the article talks about how this is making a lot of transgender and non-binary people within the U.S. feel super vulnerable, too. Like they're worried that if they travel abroad with their accurate documents, they might not be allowed back in.
Yeah, it's like they're stuck.
And there are groups pushing for the U.S. government to give some clear guidelines on this because right now it's just a mess.
Yeah, it's a huge gray area.
So, I mean, taking all these advisories together, it's pretty clear that getting into the U.S. has gotten way tougher. And not just for people who, might have expected some trouble. It's affecting a lot of different folks, but especially transgender and non-binary individuals.
Absolutely. It's like the rules of the game have changed. And if you're planning a trip to the U.S., you really got to be aware of this new landscape.
And it makes you think, right?
Yeah.
Like, as all this border stuff gets more complicated and uncertain, what does that mean for how we interact with the rest of the world,
That's the million-dollar question, right? Like, what does a secure border really mean in this context? And at what cost are we achieving it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's something we all got to be thinking about.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.